In today's video, I'm going to be showing you 3 different ways to get that snowy look in your backgrounds. So I've got my Graham paints here, and just to make it easy, I'm going to use my Prussian blue, which is a dark muted blue, and it works pretty well for backgrounds. So I'm going to do one section at a time, but I will come back at the end and show you how they look after they've completely dried. But I'm just going to start with some clean water, and I'm going to wet the top surface here. And for all of these backgrounds, I want the paper to be completely wet, but I don't want it to be oversaturated. And I'll dab off my brush and just go along the edges just to make sure there's no water puddling there. And then I'm going to take my size 12. Now I'm using the silver black velvet brushes, but use whatever brushes you have. And I'm just going to go right into my Prussian blue here. And I'm just going to get this color all over. So I want it to be pretty dark, like a night sky would be. Okay. And I'm just rinsing that brush off, and I will set it to the side. Now for this to work, I don't want it to be too wet, so I'm just going to check to see if the paint is running. And it's not, it's staying there. So I just want to give it a moment to kind of settle in, because we don't want this to be too wet or it's going to travel a lot. But I think this is a good time. So what I'm going to do is just take a separate piece of paper here just to save these areas. And all I'm going to do is take my clean water, and I'm going to dip in and just sprinkle some of this clean water on here. Just like this. And it's going to give us some texture. And the less water that you have on your fingers, the smaller the little splatters are going to be, and the bigger droplets that you have, the bigger they're going to be. So we'll go ahead and let that one dry. And I'm just going to go ahead and do the exact same thing with the next one. So I'm going to wet it, put the Prussian blue down just like I did here, and then I'll come back and show you the next technique. Okay, so I've got my color laid down there, and I'm going to go ahead and mix up my Winsor & Newton permanent white gouache. And this is just going to give the paint a second to set into the paper. And I'm just going to take this flat brush here. This is just a water brush, but I really like this for doing my gouache. And I'm just going to take some clean water and mix this up. Now I want this to be runny, but not too runny, because if it's too runny, then it's not going to be very opaque. So what I'm going to do is just take that blank paper on the bottom here, and I am going to try to keep this just in this middle area, and I'm just going to take my finger and run it back against the brush here to try to get some little splatters. And I just need a little bit more paint. And it just needs to be a little bit more runny. So this is where you need to play with that consistency of the paint. And if you want bigger spots, then you want it to be a little bit more runny. If you want little spots, like that. And you can even take another brush and like tap it off. Oh, and we got some up there. So this will give you sort of like medium size spots. And this is really fun to play around with. Now we got a couple up there, so just ignore those, but we'll wait and see how this is going to dry. Maybe I'll do a few more just little splatters here. Whoop. And so the little ones aren't going to spread as much because there's not as much water in them, whereas the bigger ones do spread out a little bit. So it just gives you an idea of different textures that you can get. But I'm going to go ahead and wash my hands and wash this out, and then we will get on to the next one. Okay, so again, for this one, we don't want too much water on the paper. We don't want it to be pooling or spreading. So if you notice your paint starting to run the opposite way, you want to let it dry a couple of minutes maybe. So the next one I'm going to show you is just using some simple table salt. Now you can experiment with using different types of salts, but I just use this regular table salt that I have, and I just take a little bit in the palm of my hand here, and then I just start sprinkling it on the paper. And you can concentrate it in a few areas, or you can spread it out evenly. And what the salt does is it soaks up pigment from the paint. So the pigment's going to soak into the salt, and it's going to leave these little white areas around it. Now it doesn't look like it's doing too much at first, so you don't want to go too crazy with the salt because this will, you know, do some textures in it. So, you know, play around with it. And the wetter it is, the more it's going to suck up the pigment from the paints. And the bigger pieces of salt that you're using will create bigger textures into the paper. But we'll go ahead and let this dry here. And maybe I'll just do a couple little pieces now that the paper is starting to dry. Once the paper starts to dry too much, you're not going to get any effect. So it's sort of like something that you're going to have to play with depending how wet the paper is and what type of salt you're using. So I'm going to go ahead and let all of this dry, and then we'll come back once it's dry and I'll show you what it all looks like. So this is what these 3 different techniques look like once they're dry. I'm just going to go ahead and take the tape off so we can see the full effect. Now, as you can see with this one, this is one of my favorite ways to do it, and you get a really nice sort of like stormy looking sky. But again, playing with your water control, so not having your paper too wet versus too dry, you're going to have to play around with that, but this creates a really cool background. Now, these were done by mistake when we did this area. They got onto that area, but as you can see, you can still combine the 2 techniques. Now this is the one where we went on top with gouache while the background was still wet. And you can see how you can get these nice little soft fluffy textures. So if you want big fluffy snowflakes, then this is kind of really cool to play around with. And this one down here was where we added the salt. And as you can see, where I put less salt, it's more dispersed. And where I clumped the salt together, we get these bigger textures. So this is another really cool technique that you can use. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Let me know down in the comments below which technique was your favorite, and do you have another technique that you use, because I would love to hear it and maybe I'll give it a try. If this video was useful to you, I'd love it if you could give it a like. Make sure you're subscribed and hit the notification bell so you're notified when I post new videos. And thank you so much for watching, and as always, I will see you in the next one. Bye!